Why is this sometimes a little difficult? Well, as we'll see in this class, yet and still can be used in almost the same sentence. They can sometimes even mean the same thing, but there are two different ways of putting them in the sentence, and they can give a slightly different meaning. So in this class, we're going to discover exactly when we use yet and when we use still, and what the small differences are. So let's look at our first slide. Still. Still refers to an action that began in the past and is continuing until now or until present. That's the first thing. Now, still can be used in a positive, negative sentence, and a question form. What does this mean exactly? Well, I have some examples here on this slide. Let's look at the first one, which is a positive sentence. Mary is still looking for a job. As you see, is in the positive form. Mary is still looking for a job. Let's look at what a negative sentence would look like. I still haven't finished the project. Notice that haven't is a negative form of the verb to have, so I have not finished the project. And the last one, are you still there? For an example, if someone's on the phone and you can't hear them anymore, you might ask, hello, are you still there? As you see, this is a question form. So now let's take a look at yet. Yet refers to an action which is presumed or expected to happen, but it hasn't happened until now. So it's an action that was supposed to have happened or was expected to have happened, but it hasn't happened yet, either because it delayed or because the time hasn't come yet. Yet is used in negative and question forms. So this is the first major difference when it comes to the sentence structure. Yet cannot be used in a positive sentence structure. So only with negative sentences and question forms. Let's look at an example here. I haven't told anyone else yet. Notice that haven't is in a negative form. I have not. I haven't told anyone else yet. Did you notice another difference between since and yet? Yet is always at the end of the sentence, whereas since is usually either after the subject or after the verb. How about the question form? Let's take a look at it. Have you talked to your boss yet? What does this mean? Well, this person has something they need to tell to their boss, but they haven't done it yet. So the person's asking, have you talked to them yet? This is a way of using yet in a question form. So now that I explained the general differences between still and yet, let's take a look at how we can use it in an activity. Take a look at this activity. There are two sentences, and one needs still and one needs yet. So now pause your screen and think which one needs still and which one needs yet. Are these the answers that you came up with? Sarah is still looking for a job. What does this mean? It means that Sarah started looking for a job a while ago, and until today she's continuing to look for a job because she still hasn't found one. So Sarah is still looking for a job. Let's look at the second sentence. Sarah hasn't found any good job yet. What's the difference? Here, instead of thinking about like something that started in the past until now, it's focusing on what hasn't happened. She hasn't found a job yet. She's expected to find a job. She's hoping to find a job. She's looking for a job, but it hasn't happened yet. And notice, once again, still is towards the beginning of the sentence, whereas yet is always at the end of a sentence. So in these kind of activities, this little difference can help you a lot. Our next class is going to be a workshop that will help you practice what you learned in this class and the previous class. I put some activities for you that combine the two different language and grammatical structures that we learned, and you'll be able to practice them thoroughly, and it will help you feel more confident when using. Welcome to our third workshop. Are you ready to do the activities? These activities are designed so that you can practice what you've learned and see if you really understood how to use these words, and it can just help you feel more confident in using them. So have a piece of paper and a pen with you and be ready to really work hard and try the activities out. Our first activity is to fill in the blanks. So in this activity, we're going to have to use still or yet. So read out the sentences and decide, is it still or yet? So pause your screen and we'll look at the answers together. Are these the answers that you came up with? Let's take a look at them one by one. Sentence 1, are you still living in Chicago? What is the person asking? The person knows that their friend used to live in Chicago, or their friend was living in Chicago, and they want to know, did they move or are they still living there? As you see, again, still is at the beginning of the sentence. Let's look at sentence 2. George hasn't taken the test yet. What does this mean? Well, George is expected to take a test, but it hasn't happened yet. Let's look at sentence 3. Jennifer still hasn't tried her new bike. What does this mean? Jennifer bought a bike, but from the day that she bought it until now, she hasn't tried it. Let's look at a little bit with Jeremy, what's happening here. Jeremy isn't familiar with his new office yet. What does this sentence tell us? Well, Jeremy recently moved to a new office, but he's not familiar with it yet. He will be familiar with it eventually. In fact, he's expected to get familiar with it. But because it's new, it hasn't happened yet, so he's still not familiar with it. In our last sentence, I'm still taking that online course. What does this mean? Well, I'm talking to someone who knows that I started taking an online course, and I'm informing them that I am continuing to take that online course. I'm still taking it. How did you do in this exercise? I'm sure you did great. Let's look at our next activity. In this activity, you have a paragraph. Now, below the paragraph, there are 3 questions. So read the paragraph out and try and find the answers to these questions. So pause your screen and take the time to really read and understand the paragraph and to write out your answers. Are these your answers? Let's take a look at each of them and see why we can answer this. The first answer is, the person lives in Manchester. How do we know that? Well, if we go back to our first slide, it says, I'm still living in Manchester. So by this sentence, we know that the person is living in Manchester. He started living in Manchester in the past, and until today, he's still in Manchester. Let's take a look at the next one. How long have this person and their mate maybe been there? It says, I've been here for more than 4 years. So what's the answer? For longer than 4 years. How do we know that? Well, it says, I've been here for 4 years. And so we know the amount right there. Our last question is, will the person move? And the answer is yes. But how do we know that? Well, it says here, we got a new place in London, but we haven't moved yet. So they're expected to move. They even have a new place, but they haven't moved yet. So as you see in this paragraph, we had a little bit of everything that we learned in the last 2 classes. We see the word still, we see the word yet, and we see the word for. Let's go to our next slide. Here we have Andy's schedule once again, but this time Andy's on vacation. Notice that it says that today is Wednesday. So on his schedule, think, okay, Wednesday is today. Now, what activities has Andy already done? What hasn't he done yet? And what is he still doing? Now, you might say, we didn't really look at the word already. Already is the opposite of yet. Yet is something that is expected to be done but hasn't been done, whereas already is something that has been done, sometimes even earlier than expected. So when you're saying, oh, I already did that, or I already saw that movie, what does it mean? It means that you've seen the movie and maybe the other person wasn't expecting that you saw the movie, but you already did. So what activities has Andy already done and which hasn't he done yet? So again, pause your screen, look at the schedule, and try and make as many sentences as you can using the grammar structure given to you. How did it go? There were lots of options. Here I have a few possible answers, but your answers may be different and still be correct. Few answers with the word yet could be, Andy hasn't gone to the zoo yet. Andy didn't go to the movies yet. And Andy hasn't started work yet. In all 3 cases, he's planning on or expected to do these activities, but it just hasn't happened yet. It will happen later on in the week. Let's take a look at answers with already. Andy already went to the beach, and Andy already met Kim for drinks. So what does this mean? Being that it's Wednesday, these activities in these sentences were things that he had planned and he did earlier in the week, so he already did them. Let's look at the next option. These are some possible answers with the word still. Andy is still on vacation, started earlier on Monday, and he's still on vacation today, Wednesday. Andy still hasn't started work. It still hasn't happened because he's still on vacation. Andy still hasn't gone to the movies. So notice, Andy still hasn't gone to the movie or Andy hasn't gone to the movies yet. It means the same thing. You can say it the way you want. Just remember that still is at the beginning of the sentence and yet is at the end of the sentence. Congratulations, you completed this workshop. Do you feel more comfortable using these words? I'm sure you do. In our next class, we're going to discuss how to talk about future events. So join me in our next class. You have reached the last class of Module 2. Let's think a little bit about what we learned so far. We learned how to talk about time, how to talk about schedules, how to talk about habits and routines, analyzing people's schedules even, and we've also learned the differences between the little words like still and yet and since and for. In this module, we really went through a lot of activities. We went through 2 workshops, so congratulations for getting all of this accomplished. This is going to be, as I mentioned, the last class of this module. What is it about? Will or going to? When do we use these sentences? Well, we use them when we're talking about the future. But what is the difference between will and going to? Let's take a look at it in our next slide. Will. Generally, when someone says, I will or I'll do something, it is a spontaneous decision. It's not something planned. It's not something that is premeditated or, as I said, scheduled or planned. It is something spontaneous on the moment. And it's often someone that is volunteering to do something. An example is, I will help you move. Again, the person is volunteering out of the spur of the moment to help this person move. Another one is, I'll call Paul for you. So the person sees the need and decides that they will volunteer or offer to call Paul. So once again, will is usually used for something that is a spontaneous decision. Let's take a look at going to. Now, going to is a planned decision. It usually is used when we're talking about something that's been booked or planned or scheduled or organized. An example is, I'm going to New York for the weekend. Again, in this case, if this is a planned vacation or trip, and the person says, I'm going to New York, or they could even say, I'm going to go to New York in the weekend or for the weekend. Another sentence here is, I'm going to the movies on Friday. So again, this is a planned schedule. Maybe he already organized it with his friends. And what's happening on Friday? He's going to go to the movies. So this is the general difference between will and going to. Now, I have a very special activity for you in the resources. So if you go to the extra resource section, you will find a role play that you can listen to. Now, on this role play, you'll be listening to a meeting between 3 coworkers, and they need to organize a very special week. So in this role play, you'll hear them use will and you'll hear them use going to. How and when do they use will, and how and then when did they use going to? I'd love to know your thoughts. So please share your opinion and what you noticed the difference was in the comment section. This brings us to the last part of our second module. Our third module is going to be about descriptions, and learning how to describe and compare activities and things and objects and countries is something that is very important in everyday language. Welcome to our third module. This whole module will be dedicated to descriptions. Why is this important? We describe things every single day. So we're going to learn how to compare things. We're going to learn how to describe activities and many more things. And like usual, there will be workshops that can strengthen our ability in doing this. So let's look at our first class. Our first class is comparisons. So there are 2 ways of comparing things in English. Let's take a look at the first one. When it comes to small words that are 1 or 2 syllables, we do this. We take the adjective and we add er or er. Now remember, if a word ends in y, it usually that y will usually turn into an I. So let's take a look at an example of this. Here we have 2 small words that start or end actually in y. So busy becomes busier. Easy becomes easier. But now let's have you give it a try. Here are 4 words. Now try and make them into the comparative form. So pause your screen and do the exercise. How did you do? Did you come up with the same answers? Small becomes smaller, cheap becomes cheaper, happy becomes happier, and notice the Y becomes an I, and smart becomes smarter. So if you wrote the same things, congratulations. Now let's look at our next slide. Here we have the second way of talking about comparisons, and this has to do with the longer words. If it's 2 or 3 syllables and it's a longer word, we don't add to the word. Instead, we say more or less, and then we add the adjective. Let's look at an example. Here we have experienced. We don't say experienceder. No, we say more experienced. And with expensive, we can say more, or in this case, less expensive. Now, why don't you try? As you see, there's 4 words here. Pause your screen and try to put them in the comparative form. Did you come up with the same answers? Let's look at them together. Intelligent becomes more or less intelligent. Thoughtful becomes more or less thoughtful. Challenging becomes more or less challenging. And difficult, more or less difficult. So let's look at the formula once again. We have 2 options. For the shorter words, we just take the adjective and add and then we also have to add the word then. For an example, New York is larger than Toronto. Let's look at the second formula. For the longer words, we'll use more or less, add the adjective, and we will use then as well. Let's look at an example. It's more expensive to live in Switzerland than in Italy. So you see, it's more expensive than. One word of caution, though, there are these three words that are irregular. Good is not gooder, it becomes better. Bad becomes worse. Far becomes further or farther, and you can decide which one of the two. But now, what about when we want to say that something is better than everything else? How can we discuss that? How can we say that? Well, in that case, you need what's called a superlative, and that is what we're going to discuss in our next class. With this class, there is an extra resource that you can do to practice comparatives even more and to also test if you understand when other people use them. So be sure to go to the extra resource on comparatives with this class. Our next class is going to talk about superlatives. So join me in our next class. Superlatives. When do we use them? As I mentioned in our previous class, we use them when we want to talk about something that is better than anything else. So how do we use superlatives in English? Well, I'll show you in this class. So let's look at our first slide. Once again, just like with comparatives, there are two different options, and we're going to learn them both. The first one is we take the, we add the adjective, and we add est. This is done with the smaller adjectives. And once again, remember, if an adjective ends in y, it becomes I. Let's look at an example. Again, we have the word busy and easy, but in this case, it's in the superlative form. So busy becomes the busiest. Easy becomes the easiest. For an example, we could say, we're all busy in our company. We're all very busy, but Carlos is the busiest. He has the most amount of work. He's the busiest. So again, we see he is the most busy, or the one that has the most amount of work. So having said this, why don't you try? We have the same words as before, so pause your screen and try and put them in the superlative form. Are these the answers that you came up with? Small becomes the smallest. Cheap becomes the cheapest. Happy, and remember it ends with a Y, becomes the happiest. And smart becomes the smartest. What about our second formula? How does that work? Well, here on my slide, you can see how it works. Again, we have the word the, but now it's a little different. The most or the least plus the adjective. So this is used for the longer words. Now let's take a look at an example. Again, we have experienced and expensive. Experienced would become the most experienced. So all of us have a lot of experience here, but Carlos, he is the most experienced. What does this mean? He has more experience than anyone else in the company. Expensive becomes the most or the least expensive. Why don't you try? Again, we have 4 words, and pause your screen and try to make them into the superlative form. Are these the answers you came up with? If you did, good job, congratulations. Now, let's look at one more thing. Like in our last class, we saw that there were 3 irregular ones. And again, the same words are irregular when it comes to superlative forms. Good becomes the best, bad becomes the worst, and far becomes the furthest or the farthest. And again, you can choose which one to use. So how do you feel now using comparisons and superlatives? I'm sure you feel more confident after these 2 classes. Our next class is going to have a workshop. And in this workshop, you're going to be able to practice even more and feel even more confident describing things and comparing things in your everyday life. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our 4th workshop. Are you ready to practice everything you learned in the last 2 classes? This is going to be a great opportunity. So make sure that you have your pen and paper and that you're ready to do the activities. Our first activity is this. As you see, there's 2 images and they're very different. Compare the 2 images. So as you see, image 1 is in the city, image 2 is in the countryside. So pause your screen and think about how you would compare the 2 images. How did you do? Did you come up with many different answers? Really, there's many different ways that you could have compared the 2 images. These are just some possible answers that you might have wrote. The first one is it's quieter in the countryside than in the city. So notice quiet, it would be the adjective. It becomes quieter when it's a comparison. And once again, we have the word than. So by adding the word than, we really know that we're comparing the 2. It's quieter in the countryside than in the city. Let's look at the next one. The city is less peaceful than in the countryside. Less peaceful. Yeah, because peaceful is a long word. So instead of saying it's peacefuler, we would actually say it's less peaceful or more peaceful, depending on the sentence. In this case, the city is less peaceful than the countryside. Let's look at our third one. Life in the city is more convenient than in the country. What does it mean that something's more convenient? Well, in the city, all the shops are nearby, and maybe the subway's nearby, and everything can be a little bit closer. But in the countryside, things are not close. So it's less convenient. It's a little harder to get everything done. Again, convenient is a long word, so we would use more or less convenient. Let's look at our next image. Here, again, we have two very different images. One has fast food and unhealthy food, and the second one has very healthy food, vegetables, and maybe even some fruits. So again, pause your screen and think of different ways that you could compare the two types of foods. What did you come up with? I'm sure there were many different options. I have two that we could look at right now, and the ones that I came up with are vegetables are healthier than eating fast food. Now again, healthy ends with a Y. So in this case, the Y becomes, you're right, becomes an I. Let's look at the second one. Fast food is less expensive than healthy food. And unfortunately, this is true in many countries. In many countries, if you want to have some really healthy food, it's very expensive, whereas fast food is often very cheap. So fast food is less expensive than healthy food. Let's look at our next slide. Aha, here we have a question for you. Which is the scariest animal that you have ever seen? Which is the most expensive country you've ever been to? And which is the least exciting vacation that you have ever had? So again, pause your screen and write down some of your answers. My personal answers are this. The scariest animal that I have ever seen was a snake. And to be very clear, it was a coral snake, and it was a scary animal because it's a dangerous animal. It's poisonous. Second, Switzerland is the most expensive country that I have ever been to. And my last answer, my vacation in Madrid, was the least exciting because I was sick. So because I was sick, I wasn't really able to go outside. I had to stay inside a lot. So it was less exciting. Now, I gave you my answers, but I would love to hear your answers. So please share your answers below. And if you had any answers in any of these exercises that you're not sure were correct, feel free to ask and I will get back to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, our next class is going to be all about compound nouns. So join me in our next class. What are compound nouns? Well, I have a little description for you here. The definition is a compound noun is a noun consisting of two or more words working together as a single unit. So what does this mean? It means you take two words that individually mean two different things, but when you put them together, they create a third word. Now, English has a lot of compound nouns. In fact, in our earlier classes, we already saw quite a few. All those words with some, any, like something, anything, everything, nothing, those are all compound nouns. Let's look at a few other examples. We have water bottle, mother-in-law, and toothpaste. Notice how water bottle there's a space in between. It's still two words, but put next to each other, it gives a different meaning than if they were two separate words in two separate sentences. Mother-in-law has little lines in between it, and those are called hyphens. And toothpaste is all together as one word. Now, compound nouns can be different. They can be written in any of these three forms, and there's no real rule on how to know which one is attached and which one is separated. Some might have a rule, but generally speaking, it just kind of comes with once you know the word, you know how to spell it. But don't let that intimidate you in any way. Let's take a look at some words and see if you can make your own compound nouns. So here, as you see, there's 8 words in the first column and 8 words in the second column. By combining the words, you can create new words. So pause your screen and try and match the words from the first column to the words in the second column to create a new word. How did you do? I'm sure you came up with these words that are here. As you see, there's sunglasses, classmates, greenhouse, snowboard, boyfriend, lifeboat, doorbell, and bookstore. Now, let's take a look at this a little bit. For an example, let's look at sunglasses. We all know what the sun is. It's the star that's closest to our Earth. It's thanks to the sun we have life. And glasses is usually what someone wears when they can't see well. But when we put the two words together, sunglasses, we create a new word, which is a word that describes the glasses you wear, not because you can't see well, but you wear it when there's a lot of sun. This works with all of these words. For an example, you can have, there can be a boy, and friend is just a normal friend. But once you put it together, a boyfriend, that's someone that you are dating and someone that you love in a special way. So these are just a few of compound nouns, but if you look online, there's a long list of them. In fact, there's so many compound nouns in English. And what's great about them is that these nouns help describe things, are very descriptive. And with time, you're going to learn more and more of them. In this course, in fact, we've already learned a lot. We have these 8 words, but then we also have all the words at the beginning of the course, like anything, anyone, anywhere, and so forth. So which compound nouns do you use regularly? I'd love to hear from you. So please share your experience with compound nouns in the comments below. In the next class, we're going to see how to describe activities. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our class on describing activities. But first, what did we learn so far in this module? We learned how to compare 2 different things, how to express your opinion on 2 different things, what you think is better, and what is more convenient to you. We also learned how to use superlatives. We had a workshop. And also we had a little discussion on compound nouns and how present they are in the English language. In this class, we're going to discuss how to describe activities. And once again, the reason for this is because we are always describing the activities that we do, whether it's at work and you're describing a project or you're describing a need that someone has, or whether you're just with friends and you're describing your hobbies and why you like to do them. So let's take a look at how to do this in English. First of all, let's think of a few activities. As you see here on the slide, we have to ski. To ski, if you put it in the continuous form, becomes skiing. To swim, so that's the verb, the activity becomes swimming. To run becomes running, and to paint becomes painting. Now, why is this important? Well, we will see why in the next slide. The way that we can describe an activity is by using the activity in the continuous form. So you take the verb, the initial verb, so like for example, skiing, or to ski, you put in the continuous form, skiing, and then you add the verb is, for an example, and then an adjective, fun. Let's look at these examples here. Running is good for you. You could also say running is difficult. Running is relaxing, whatever you want. Notice how the pattern is. First, you talk about the activity itself, you use a verb, and then an adjective to describe it. Okay, let's look at the other one. Kayaking. Kayaking is fun. Kayaking is dangerous. Kayaking is relaxing. You can use whatever adjective you like. The important thing is that the activity is in an ing or a continuous form. Okay, so now we know how to describe activities, and I'd love to hear which activities you do. So feel free to comment in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. But also, now we really need to be able to practice this. So in our next class, we're going to have a workshop that's all about describing activities. There's going to be images, and you're going to have full board, or you can have full freedom to describe them the way you want. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our 5th workshop. What can you expect with this workshop? Well, we just learned how to describe activities. So now you're going to have the opportunity to have full freedom in describing the activities that I will show you. Also, we'll get the chance to review our comparatives a little bit more. So I hope you're ready with pen and paper, and we can start our activities. Look at the slides here. There are 2 different activities. The first one is hiking, or to hike, and the second one is to rock climb, or rock climbing. How would you describe these 2 activities? What do you think about them? So at this point, pause your video and try and write down a few sentences describing these activities. How did you do? Did you come up with a lot of sentences? Really, there could be so many different ways of describing these 2 activities. Here are a few possible answers. Hiking is fun. But what if someone doesn't think that hiking is fun? How do you say the opposite? Well, you could say hiking is boring, or you could say hiking isn't fun. Let's look at other things. Hiking is good for you. Rock climbing is an extreme sport. Rock climbing takes a lot of strength. As you see here, you can have short sentences and you can also have long sentences, but they all follow the same formula. Now, what if you want to put it in a negative form? Remember, you just have to change the verb to a negative verb. For an example, rock climbing is an extreme sport. That might be what I think, but maybe someone else doesn't agree. That person could say rock climbing isn't an extreme sport. So you have full flexibility of being able to describe these activities the way you like. Let's go on to our next activity. Once again, we have the exact same activities, but now we need to compare them. So think back to our class on comparatives, and you have another opportunity of being able to compare these two activities. So again, we have hiking and we have rock climbing. What are the differences? How would you compare them? So again, pause your screen and write down as many sentences as you can to compare the two activities. How did you do? Did you come up with a lot of sentences? There are many different ways that you could compare the two activities, but these are just a few options right here. The first one is hiking is easier than rock climbing. And again, easy ends with a Y, so the Y will become an I. Hiking is safer than rock climbing. Rock climbing is more dangerous than hiking. Rock climbing takes more strength than hiking does. So you see how these two activities got to be compared or were compared? So these are my answers, but what were your answers? I would love if you could share your answers in the comment section. I'd love to see what you wrote. And if you're not sure that you wrote something correctly, please ask and I will happily answer as soon as I can. In the meantime, we came to the end of our module. But to finish it off just perfectly, we have an extra resource for you. So this extra resource is called Extra Resource on Describing Activities. So go into the resource and you're going to learn about a certain activity, and you're going to have a nice exercise for you to be able to practice this language that we learned and the vocabulary that we learned even more extensively. In the meantime, our fourth module and our last module is going to be on abilities and expectations. And both of these are very important, especially in the work environment. So join me in our fourth and last module. Welcome to our fourth and last module. Before getting into what this module is going to be about, I think this is a perfect time to ask you what you think about the course so far. Which workshops, which activities, and which classes have been most useful to you? Also, if you have any concerns or if there's anything that wasn't very clear to you and you'd like to double check that you understood correctly, or if there's any sentence that you wrote and you're not sure that you wrote it correctly, please write it in the comment section and I will happily take a look at it and answer any concern that you have. Also, feel free to share your experience and your feedback for this course. I'd love to hear how you feel and what you're thinking about this course. Now, what can we look forward to in our next module? Our next module, or this one, is abilities and expectations. So first of all, a question to you. When do you think it is important to be able to talk about your abilities or skills? Feel free to comment that also in the comment section. What about expectations? When are expectations discussed? So we're going to look at all of these things and more in this coming module. So let's go right away and start with our first class. Abilities. First of all, what are abilities? Our abilities are your skills, the things that you have learned to do. Some of them might be natural abilities that you just know how to do. It could be talents. It could also be hobbies. And abilities can also be something that you went to school for, either because you had to learn something specific or just because you like doing something and you wanted to learn it. So how do you discuss these abilities with others? For an example, with your friends, or when you're meeting a new friend, you might want to talk about your abilities, your hobbies, the things you know how to do, and the things you like to do. This way you can communicate with them and get to know them better, and they can get to know you better. There's another area where you could use abilities, or you will need to talk about your abilities, and that is in a job interview or when you're talking to a client. You need to be able to show them and explain to them what you are capable of. So how can we discuss this? Well, this is what this class is about. Let's look at our first slide. At the very top of our first slide, you'll see that there is a formula. Know how to plus the verb. For an example, I know how to draw people. So someone that knows how to draw people is generally an artist. How would you say this in the third person, though, talking about someone else? In this case, you would say she knows how to draw people. What if someone doesn't have that skill? Well, we'd say I don't know how to draw people. And if someone wants to ask if you have a certain ability, they can ask, do you know how to draw people? Or if asking about someone else, does she know how to draw people? So this know how to is a way in English that we use to be able to describe an ability or a skill that someone has. Let's look at the other examples. I know how to ride a bike. I know how to read in Arabic. And that's not true. I don't know how to read in Arabic, but the example is that one. So what are some things that you know how to do? How do you feel with what you just learned? Don't you feel like you need a workshop to be able to practice it? Well, I have good news for you. Our next class is a workshop, and it's all about describing what you know how to do. So come along with me into our next class, and we will have our 6th workshop. Welcome to our 6th workshop. What is this workshop going to be about? Well, in our previous class, we learned how to talk about abilities and skills. So now this workshop is going to help you understand it even better, to be able to express it and feel more comfortable with this kind of language. So let's go ahead and see our first slide. So what do we have here? This is a guessing game. So read the sentence below and think, who could this be talking about? So the question is, or the sentence is, I know how to save people's lives. Who could that be? Pause your screen and write down the answer. How did it go? Did you write down a doctor, a nurse, or a firefighter maybe? If you did, then you're correct. They do know how to save lives. But did you maybe write down someone else? If you thought of a different person who also saves lives, please share it in the comment section. I'd love to see what you came up with. Let's go on to our next activity. Again, we have to guess who this is talking about. I know how to teach people how to read and write. Who could that be? Well, again, pause your screen and try and think of who this could be. How did you do? Did you write teacher by any chance? Yeah, teachers know how to teach people how to read and how to write, especially children. But now maybe you wrote something else. For an example, maybe you wrote mother, and we know mothers know how to do everything. So if you wrote something else, please share it. I would love to see what you came up with. Let's go to our next one. I know how to fly a plane. Who could this be? Pause your screen and write down your answer. Did you come up with pilot too? Yes, pilots know how to fly a plane. But now, what if we want to say that we don't have an ability? How do we say it? Do you remember? How would you say that you don't have the ability to fly a plane, for an example? So think about it for a minute. Maybe even pause your screen if you'd like, and think about how you would say it. Were you able to think about how to say it? Did you think, I don't know how to fly a plane? If you use the word don't, that would be correct. So I don't know how to fly a plane. Now, what would you say if you wanted to ask someone if they have the ability to fly a plane? How would you ask that question? Again, pause your screen and think about it for a moment. Well, you could have come up with the sentence, or the question better said, do you know how to fly a plane? If you're talking about another person, you could have asked, does he or she know how to fly a plane? Or a group of people, do they know how to fly a plane? See, in this workshop, we're seeing how to discuss abilities. Why is this important? Well, we talk about abilities all the time. And especially, we need to be able to know how to ask people about their abilities if you're ever interviewing someone for a job, for an example, or if you're being interviewed. It also helps us to get to know people better. So in this workshop, we got to see different ways of discussing abilities and how to understand them as well. But now I know that you have many abilities, maybe talents and abilities in your work, and I'd love to get to know all the students in this course. So please comment what you know how to do, what your abilities are, what your talents are, and maybe even what you don't know how to do, but that you'd like to learn. Comment all these things in the comment section, and I will be happy to read through them all. In the meantime, I'll be waiting for you in our next class, which is all about talking about our needs. So I'll see you there. So now let's talk about needs. First of all, what are needs and why is it important to learn how to talk about them? Well, let's look at our first slide to see what are needs. Here it explains that a need is something that is essential to life. For an example, our basic human needs is to be able to eat, to sleep, and to drink. These three things help us to live and survive. But when we're talking about needs, it's not only about the most essential needs, but it could be other necessities that we have. So why is it important to know how to talk about this? Well, if you're working with other people or even living with other people, you need to be able to express what is necessary or what your necessities are. You also need to be able to ask people to help you do things. So, how does that work? Well, let's take a look at our next slide. Let's see how we can use the word need. So as it says here, we use it to talk about important things. So in English, if someone says that they need you to do something, they're telling you that it's very important for you to do this. It can also be a way of asking someone to help you. Let's look at the two examples here. I really need to get a good night's sleep tonight. What does this sentence tell us? Well, maybe this person hasn't slept very well that week, and maybe he's feeling or she's feeling very, very tired. So it's really important for them that they can sleep well that night. Or maybe they have an important project the next day and they really need to sleep well to be able to do a good job on the project. Let's look at the second sentence. I need you to call the client and tell him. Now, there are many ways of asking someone to do something for you, but why would someone choose to say, I need you to do something? Well, by saying, I need you to call the client or to go somewhere, you're expressing or explaining to the person that it is very important for them to do something for you. And that way, the person will know that it's top priority. Okay, so now that we've discussed a little bit how we use the word need, let's look at our next slide. This slide shows how we're going to use it in a negative form. And the simple way is don't need, or for the third person, doesn't need. For an example, I don't need your help right now. This means that the person is saying that it is not necessary to help him. Or, you didn't need to do that. Now, this last one is actually an English expression, and people usually say this when someone did a kind or very nice thing for them. So the person says, oh, you didn't need to do that. Thank you. It's really a way of showing appreciation. And again, as you see, it's in a negative form. Let's look now at our next slide. Here, we're going to discuss a little bit about question forms. How do we ask about other people's needs or necessities? For an example, does he need help? Maybe you see someone that seems to be having a difficult time. So you ask someone, does that person need help? Or you could ask someone directly, what do you need me to do? If your question starts with do or does, you're asking a yes or no question. So the answer will be yes or no. Yes, I need help, or no, I don't need help. Thank you. If you're asking a question with what, like what do you need me to do, you're leaving the answer open to the person to explain exactly what is necessary to be done. So now we see how we use the word need. As we saw, we can put it in a negative form, in a positive form, and in a question form. But now, do you feel like you need a workshop to just strengthen your new acquired skill on how to use the word need? Yes, I think so. So our next class is going to be a workshop that helps you practice talking about your needs and necessities and talking about other people's needs and necessities. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our 7th workshop. In our previous class, we learned how to discuss our needs and necessities and how to ask people to help us by saying that we need their help. But now, in this workshop, we're going to learn how to use it in a little bit more of a freer and comfortable way. So let's start right away with our first activity. Look at the picture here. What do you see? Do you see a child? Yeah, it's a little girl. She's playing with balloons. Now, there's a question with this. What do children need to grow into responsible adults? What do you think? So again, what do children need, or what is important to help a child grow into a responsible adult? So again, pause your screen and write your personal opinion and answer. Did you find a lot of things to write about? Really, there could be a long list of things that can benefit a child and help them to grow into a responsible adult. But here are just 3 examples of something that you could have written. A child needs to be loved. That's the first one. The second, children need direction. Now, careful here, when we talk about a child, that's the singular form and we're talking about one child. On the other hand, by saying a child, we know that we're talking about children in general. So the word means the same thing, but it's in the singular form. Notice that because it's a singular form, it's the third person. A child needs, with S, to be loved. Children, instead, is the plural form of child, and it also means just general children, a child in general. But notice that need does not have an S. So children need direction. A third option could be children need quality time with their parents. So this is a way of talking about the general needs that a child or children could have. What were your answers? I'd like to know what you wrote as well. So feel free to comment them. If you're not sure that one of the sentences you wrote is correct, please ask. I would love to look it over and give you some feedback. Now we see the picture again on our slides, but it's a different question. What don't children need? What does this mean? Well, this question means what is not necessary for a child to still grow as a responsible adult. So think of the things that aren't necessary for a child to grow properly and in a successful way. So again, pause your screen and write down your answers. Did you find a lot of things to write about? Here are just a few options of what you may have written. A child doesn't need to have lots of toys to be happy. What does this mean? By saying a child doesn't need to have lots of toys, it means it is not necessary for a child to have lots of toys. So in a home where maybe children don't have a lot of toys, but they have a lot of love, they still will be happy children. Let's look at the second sentence. Children don't need to live in a rich home to be successful. What does this mean? It is not necessary for children to be in a rich home or have rich parents for them to grow into successful adults. So as you see here, we just looked at how to discuss the needs of someone, for an example, what is necessary, and also what isn't necessary. So I shared some of my answers, but what are your answers? Please comment them in the comment section. I would love to see what you wrote. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Our next class is going to be about talking about expectations. So join me in our next class. What do we mean by expectations? Well, expectations are usually what you expect of someone else, or you hope from someone else, or you would wish from someone else, or they could be what someone else expects from you. Why is it important to know how to talk about this? Well, because anytime you're in some kind of a relationship with other people, whether it's a work relationship or a family relationship or a friendship, for everything to go smoothly and to be peaceful, we need to be able to discuss what we expect from them, and we need to know what they expect from us. So this course is going to talk about this, specifically when it comes to rules or guidelines of behavior. So let's take a look at our first slide. So talking about rules, as you see here, we have a few different words that we could use. So there's should or shouldn't, must or mustn't, have to or don't have to, need and needn't. Did you notice that need is there again? Yes, we can use need also when we're talking about an expectation or even a rule. So let's look exactly of when we use each one of these words. Let's take a look at should and shouldn't. So should, first of all, is not a rule. When do we use should or shouldn't? Well, we usually use it to talk about something that would be beneficial or better to do or not to do. For an example, you should brush your teeth 3 times a day. Now, will something bad happen if you don't? Will the police come and get you? No, it's not a rule, but it is better for your teeth and your general health. The second sentence is you shouldn't lie. Once again, that's not really a rule. But generally, if you are truthful with the people at work, with your friends, and with your family, you usually have more trust and a better relationship. So it's better not to lie. So whenever we use words like should and shouldn't, we are usually using it in a form of advice, saying what would be better for the person to do or not to do, or what would be better for us to do or not to do. Let's look at our next slide. As you can see here, must is a rule. So we could use must or mustn't, which means must not. This is usually for a rule that is possible to break. For an example, let's look at the examples here. You must be quiet during class. Is that a rule that's easy to break? Yes, it is very easy to break this rule. But there are consequences if we break it. Let's look at the second sentence. You mustn't eat in class. Does it happen sometimes to eat in class? Maybe on a day you didn't have time to have breakfast, you maybe have a little snack in class. It is a rule that's easy to break. However, if the teacher sees you, there is a consequence. Now, will you go to jail for this or to prison? No, it's not such a strict consequence. So why am I mentioning this? Well, let's look at our next slide and I'll explain. Here we have to or don't have to. So have to is also a rule, but it usually is a very strict rule with stronger consequences if broken. What does don't have to mean? Now careful, don't have to is not the same as mustn't. Mustn't means you must not and is a rule, but don't have to actually means that something is not necessary. Does that sound a little confusing? Maybe. So let's take a look at the example here to understand it a little better. You have to be 21 to drink alcohol in the USA, but you don't have to be 21 to drive. So let's analyze this a little bit. You have to be 21 to drink alcohol in the USA. You have to. That is a very strict rule, and if you drink as a minor, there's a very severe consequence. But you don't have to be 21 to drive. Does this mean that you can't drive when you're 21? No, it means it's not necessary to be 21 to start driving. You can start driving before 21, usually around 16, 17. So do you see the difference between mustn't and don't have to? Let's look at our next slide. In this slide, we have need and needn't. And again, we see that need is used to explain a rule. Needn't instead is the same as don't have to, which means that something is not necessary. Let's look at our examples. You need to finish high school before going to university. That's a pretty strict rule, and there's very few exceptions to that. Do you see how they said it? You need to finish high school, or it's necessary to finish high school before going to university. So you see how need can also be a rule. Let's look at the second one, though. You needn't tell me, I already know. Is this person telling the other person not to say something? No, that person's just saying that it's not necessary to tell them that information because they already know it. So once again, needn't means that something is not necessary. Let's look at a fun fact here. Depending on where someone lives or where someone's from, they may use these words a little differently. For an example, in the UK, they tend to use must and mustn't a lot more than they do in the US. In the US, you'll hear have to or don't have to more often. And instead of hearing mustn't, you usually will hear can't. So depending on where someone's from, they might choose different words. And also for you, you can choose your words as well, as long as you know exactly which one each one means, what they mean exactly. So how do you feel after this class? Is it a little bit clearer? I'm sure it is, but I'm also sure that you might want to have a little bit more practice, wouldn't you? So at the end of this class, check the extra resources on expectations. And there you'll have the chance to listen to someone talking about their rules at work or suggested rules for a workplace, and you can give your opinion on it. Also, in our next class, we're going to have a workshop, and this workshop is going to strengthen your abilities even more, and you're going to feel even more confident in using this language structure that we just learned. So come and join me in our next class. Welcome to Workshop 8. Are you ready to practice everything that we learned in our previous class? I hope you have your pen and paper and you're ready because there's a lot of activities in this workshop. You'll also have a lot of opportunities to share in the comment section your personal opinions and preferences as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing all the wonderful comments that you leave as well. So let's start with our first activity. In this activity, we have a list of family house rules. Which words would you use from the previous class to discuss these rules? Is it must, mustn't, should, need? I'll leave it up to you. So just pause your screen and try and work on this activity. How did you do? Did you notice that there were some options that could work in the same sentence or many different options? Yeah, because we're all talking about words that talk about rules. For an example, you might have said, you must respect everyone. That would be appropriate. That's correct. Or maybe you said, you have to respect everyone. That's also correct. Or you need to respect everyone because it's important. It's a necessity. And yes, again, that would be correct. Let's look at sentence 2. You don't have to be perfect. Maybe you use you needn't be perfect, and that would also be correct. You mustn't expect perfection from others. Let's look at the next ones. If you don't have anything nice to say, then you just shouldn't say it. Again, this is not really a rule, but it's better not to say anything that's not nice, so you shouldn't say it. If you do something wrong, you need to tell mom and dad. This is a rule that many households have, and they're explaining the necessity or the importance of telling your parents if something happens. How did you do? What were your answers? Also, I'd love to know what some of your house rules were as a child. So please comment below, what were some of the rules that you had growing up? Let's look at our next activity in the meantime. Here now we have a list of company rules. So these are rules at work. Which words would you use in these sentences? So again, pause your screen and complete the activity. How did you do? Again, there are some words that could work in the same sentences. Let's take a look at some of these answers. You shouldn't take long breaks. Now, sometimes someone needs a longer break, so it's not usually a rule in a workplace, but it's good to know that it's better not to take very long breaks unless it's absolutely necessary. The second sentence, let's take a look at this one. You have to, or you must, or you need to be punctual. This is something that many companies expect from their workers. Let's look at the third sentence. You don't have to, or you needn't, wear a tie to work. Something casual but dignified is fine. Some companies decide to let their workers dress the way they want. And so what is the sentence saying? It says it's not necessary to wear a tie. You can if you want to, but it's not necessary. What are some of the company rules at the place that you work? Or if you're still in school, what are some of the school rules or classroom rules that you have? Share your experience below. I'd love to get to know a little bit more about your circumstances. Let's go on to our next activity. This activity is an open question to you. What health advice would you give? So notice here, we're no longer talking about rules. We're talking about advice. Do you remember which words we use when we're talking about advice or we're giving advice to someone? Write down some of the answers or the main types of advice that you would give to someone that's asking you advice on health. So how someone can be healthier. I wrote down my answers and you can see them here on the slides. But as you see, there are some words that are missing. So pause your screen and try and complete my answers. How did you do? Are these the answers that you came up with? Let's look at them a little bit. To be healthy, you should eat lots of fruits and vegetables. Again, it's not really a rule, but it is a strong suggestion. It really is better for your body if you eat lots of fruits and vegetables. So in this case, we would use the word should. Let's look at the next one. You need to or you should exercise regularly. What's the difference between need to and should? Need to is more forceful. It says it is absolutely necessary to exercise regularly, whereas should isn't as forceful. It's not as strong. It's more of a light suggestion. In this case, both of them could work in this sentence. You shouldn't eat lots of sugar. Again, it's better not to eat a lot of sugar. And you need to get lots of sleep, or you should get lots of sleep. Again, because sleep is so important, you might choose to go for the words need to express how important it is to get lots of sleep and how necessary it is for your whole well-being and your health. Now, what advice did you come up with? What would you suggest to me to help me have better health? Or what do you do to stay healthy? I'd love to see your comments in the comment section. In the meantime, our next class is going to be about reflexive pronouns. So join me in our next class. Reflexive pronouns. What are reflexive pronouns? Let's take a look at a definition in our next slide. Here it says, reflexive pronouns are words ending in self or selves that are used when the subject and the object of a sentence are the same. So what does this mean? Well, there's an example below. I believe in myself. Who's the subject of this sentence? I. It's talking about me. Who's the object in this sentence? Again, it's me. I believe in myself. And notice myself ends in self, meaning the person's talking about themselves. So, okay, let's take a look at these reflexive pronouns in more detail. As you see here, there is a list of reflexive pronouns. Let's start with the singular ones. Me becomes myself. You becomes yourself. When we're talking about him, it becomes himself. And when we're talking about her, we're talking about herself. If we're talking about one, we're talking about oneself. Now, who's one? One is when we talk about a general person, a general universal rule that works for everyone. So when we're talking about the general person, we often use the word one or oneself. We'll see some examples of that later on in our workshop. Let's look at it now. If we're talking about maybe like an animal and we say it, we say itself if we're using the reflexive pronoun. Notice how all of these end in self because they're singular. Let's take a look at the plural ones now. With the plural ones, we have these options. We have we, so including myself. We becomes ourselves. And notice it finishes in selves because it's plural. You, plural, so all of you becomes yourselves. And them, so a third party, and it's a plural, third party, themselves. So this is the list of the reflexive pronouns. Let's take a look a little bit at an example in our next slide. Let's see Carlos. So in our first sentence, Carlos is talking to Anne. Who's the subject? Carlos. Who's the object? Anne. Carlos is talking to Anne. Look at the second sentence now, and what's the difference? Carlos is talking to himself. So who's the subject? Carlos. And who is Carlos talking to? Carlos. He's talking to himself. Maybe he's practicing a speech, so he's like practicing it by himself. Or maybe he's talking out a problem to himself and trying to find a solution. We don't know. Either way, we know that Carlos is talking to himself. Okay, here now we have a quote of a famous singer, and he says, "And I say to myself, what a wonderful world." So after having studied this a little bit, let's move on to our next class, which is a workshop. And this workshop is going to give us the opportunity to practice using these reflexive pronouns in a way that we feel confident. So join me in our next class. Welcome to our 9th workshop. This is actually our last workshop of the whole course. I'm so excited for you. This course went by so quickly, and I'm sure you learned a lot. So without further ado, let's start this workshop. In our last class, we discussed reflexive pronouns. Now, let's practice what you learned. The exercises to follow are going to have a similar format, so this one is just an example. What does it say to do? It says change the following sentences by using reflexive pronouns. An example is, John is mad at Jill. How could you change it? You could say, John is mad at himself. What's the difference? In the first one, he's mad at someone else. But in the second sentence, he's just mad or angry at himself. So this is how you'd have to do the rest of the activities that come after this one. So let's go on and see how those go. Okay, here we have 3 sentences. I keep telling Sarah that things will get better. She keeps lying to Jack. They're rewarding Samantha with a nice meal. How would you change these sentences? Pause your screen and work on the activity. How did it go? It sometimes can be a little bit confusing with the different people in the sentences, but I'm sure you did great. Let's take a look at them together. I keep telling Sarah that things will get better. How can we change that? I keep telling myself that things will get better. So this person is reassuring themselves. Maybe they feel a little anxious and they're reassuring themselves. Let's look at the second one. She keeps lying to Jack. She keeps lying to herself. Yes, we can lie to ourselves as well. Let's look at the third answer. They're rewarding Samantha with a nice meal. Or they're rewarding themselves with a nice meal. Did you know that you can reward yourself as well? Have you ever done that? Maybe you had to study a lot or you had a big project and you said, okay, at the end of this project, I'm going to do something that I really like, or I'm going to eat my favorite food, or I'm going to have this piece of cake. That's you rewarding yourself. So you see, these things we can reward ourselves, we can lie to ourselves, and we can talk to ourselves. There's many things that we can do to ourselves. So without further ado, let's go to the next one. Aha! Here we have expressions, and these expressions contain reflexive pronouns. These are expressions that English-speaking people use very regularly, so it's good for you to at least know what they mean. Let's look at this. First of all, do you remember what oneself is? Oneself is the general person, talking about the general human nature, the general person. So, to be oneself. What does it mean to be oneself? What does it mean if I say that I feel I can be myself? Second one, to help oneself. And the third one, to keep to oneself. What do you think these mean? Well, you have a few options next to them. Try and match the sentences to the correct definition. Pause your screen and work on the exercise. How did you do? Expressions are hard to understand, so if you had a little bit of trouble, don't despair, don't worry. We're going to look at them together. To be oneself means to feel comfortable and natural, and usually we talk about being able to be ourselves with someone. So I really feel like I can be myself with so-and-so. So once again, to be oneself means to feel natural, to feel comfortable, to be yourself. Okay, let's look at the next one. To help oneself. Notice what it says here, to take something without asking permission. When you're invited over for a meal, the person inviting you might tell you to help yourself. It means don't wait for them to give you the food that's on the table, but you can take as much as you want and what you want without asking. It's all for you. Let's look at the third one, to keep to oneself. What does this mean? It means to be isolated or to stay away from people, to be a little bit more introverted. Let's see how we can use these sentences or these expressions in normal sentences. Here we have 3 sentences, and we need to put one of the expressions that we just learned in each slot. So again, pause your screen and think, which expression goes where? How did you do? I'm sure you did really good. Let's look at this. Please help yourself to some cake. What are they telling you to do? Well, they're saying, don't ask, go ahead and take some cake. So that's what it means to help oneself. You can also ask someone, can I help myself? Meaning, can I go and take what I'd like? Let's look at the second one. I feel I can be myself with Jill. What is this person saying? This person might not feel comfortable with everyone, but this person feels very comfortable with Jill, to the point that they feel like they're 100% themselves when they're with Jill. Let's look at the third one. Jordan and Kate tend to keep to themselves. What does this mean? Well, it means that Jordan and Kate don't spend a lot of time with other people. They like to be by themselves or isolate themselves, maybe spend a lot of time at home rather than going out with friends and family. So these are some expressions that are useful. You'll hear English speakers use these, and if you can use them as well, that'll always make the other person happy to hear. This is actually the end of our last workshop. I'm so proud of you for getting this far. Now, do you remember at the very beginning of our course, we took a diagnostic exam? And remember I told you that you'd have the opportunity to take it again and to compare your progress and your results? This is the time to do it. So if you go to the extra resources, you'll find the exam again. Take it and then compare the results. I'm sure you're going to see a huge difference. Also, I'd love to hear how it went, so please comment that as well in the comment section. Now, there is still one more class. So please, after taking your exam, join me in our very last class. Welcome to our last class of the course, our conclusion. Congratulations! You managed to go through the whole course. What did you learn? Thanks to this course, you know how to talk about future events. You know how to describe activities, including projects or anything that you'd have to describe at work. You know how to analyze schedules, talk about plans. You can talk about expectations and abilities. You can discuss things that have already happened and things that haven't happened yet, and many more things. So you've learned a lot, and this is something that you can take with you anywhere you go in your professional development. So truly, congratulations. I'm so excited for you. Now, there's only one thing left to do. Please don't forget, after all this hard work, don't forget to take the exam. Once you pass the exam, you can download your certificate and you can add that to your professional portfolio. Also, I would love to know how your experience was. So please leave your review and some feedback and some comments about this course. I hope to see you in another course. In the meantime, all the best on your exams.